I'm just going to introduce everyone, and we have Bill Moomaw, Professor Emeritus at Tufts University, Ona Ferguson, who is with the Consensus Building Institute, and then Patrick Welch, who is part of our climate strategies team here at the Lincoln Institute. And the journalist moderator for this session is Amanda Kolson Hurley from Bloomberg. And over to you then, Amanda.
Thank you, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, everybody. Since this is the first panel, although we've already had a wonderful presentation to kick us off, I thought I might start with just a little bit of quick context on the climate-land connection. In preparation for this, I revisited the IPCC's special report on climate change and land from a couple of years ago. And so just it seemed like these data points might be worth keeping in mind as we talk today and tomorrow. First, that human use directly affects more than 70% of the world's ice-free land surface, which is obviously quite a lot of it. Land is both a source and a sink of greenhouse gases and plays a key role in the exchange of energy, water, and aerosols between the land surface and the atmosphere. We're going to be talking about land being in competition. Climate change creates additional stresses on land, exacerbating existing risks to livelihoods, biodiversity, human and ecosystem health, infrastructure, and food systems. Impacts on land are projected to increase under all future emission scenarios. However, sustainable land management can contribute to reducing the negative impacts of multiple stressors, including climate change, on ecosystems and societies. So I think just in those few findings, there's obviously a lot of complexity implied. So I hope this can be a really good conversation about some of those complexities. And actually, one of those, the findings about stressors and demands, I think, is a good segue for me throwing the first question to Patrick, which is rising demand for food, water, and energy, as well as urban expansion, will strain the world's land in coming decades, not to mention the need to sequester carbon. So can you offer an overview of some of the conflicts that you're seeing over land use right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it'll kind of set the stage nicely, kind of taking the high level view of some of these competing needs. But first, I just want to say what a pleasure and a privilege it is to be here in person with all of you. So thank you all for being here and everyone that put this together. It's really exciting. I'm looking forward to the next couple of days. So thinking about the different claims on land that climate change presents, the issue is really about the scale of these competing needs and the new claims on land that are being presented. So if you look at pretty much all the pathways to limit warming to anywhere close to 1.5 degrees, they all rely on reducing demands on agricultural lands, stopping the conversion stopping the conversion or degradation of our natural lands and forested lands, and large-scale deployment of renewable energies and some land-based carbon sequestration. And so all these bring up a lot of different interrelated conflicts, but I'm going to frame now just kind of 3 broad ones. The first, production versus conservation. The second, kind of this food versus fuel production conflict. And then the third around kind of the conflicts that arise around renewables. So looking towards 2050, the population is projected to be around 10 billion people. So when we think about reducing the demands on agricultural lands, we're talking about feeding an additional 2 billion people on the same amount of land that we're using today. And if we don't do that, agricultural lands are going to replace the natural lands and forested lands that we're relying on for carbon sequestration, for protecting biodiversity, for providing clean water, and the whole host of other ecosystem services. So that is one, quite large overarching conflict that is arising. And the second, as we're moving away from fossil fuels, the claims on land for biofuels also prevents this conflict of food versus fuel production. Just to produce 2% of the world's energy from liquid biofuels would require expanding agricultural production by some 30%. And that clearly kind of only worsens that first conflict that was mentioned. So another kind of high-level conflict there. And then thinking about renewables, obviously solar and wind and all the associated transmission infrastructure requires some land. There was a recent Princeton study that found that, just in the U.S., an area the size of Wyoming and Colorado combined could be required for meeting domestic clean energy goals. But the good thing about solar and wind is it can often kind of accommodate other land uses too, kind of getting to Mac's point of the multitasking of land. And there's been some promising results coming out of these agrivoltaic systems where you have solar arrays several meters above croplands, and findings suggest that you can increase yields in kind of a more diverse variety of crops using these systems, but they also increase the efficiency of the solar panels themselves. So there's a hint at a solution there. And then you mentioned urbanized areas placing kind of additional conflicts, and I'll end with that. Even though cities account for a very small percentage of the total land area, they play a really important role in this competition and conflict. If controlling sprawl, reducing emissions in urban areas, ultimately requires less land for sequestration elsewhere. And when you have outward urban expansion, it generally comes at the expense of agriculture. So in a sense, compact urban places and settlements kind of act as a conservation strategy in a sense, and can kind of help resolve some of these conflicts. Yeah, those are some kind of high-level examples of these conflicts that we're seeing arise, but I'm sure we can dive deeper in this panel or in the coming sessions.
That's a great overview. Thanks. So we've heard about some of these broader types of conflicts. Bill, I wondered if you could talk about some of the policy failures that have contributed to them or are failing to resolve them.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. The policies, most of our policies favor the economic sector. And since land is basically considered a commodity, its economic value, you heard that earlier in the discussion, just the previous presentation, that's a huge problem. And what is on the land, the soil, if it's a forest, it's the trees. If it's a grassland, it's the grass for the livestock. And it was mentioned those are all commodities, and so the price of that determines everything, what that happens to the land. And yet no one is doing. I'm not always a great fan of cost-benefit analysis because it can be badly manipulated, but nobody seems to do the cost-benefit analysis of the damages we're having because of climate change that could be reduced if we used land to accumulate. And accumulate's the right verb to use. Sequestration is a confusing word because sometimes people use it to mean the removal and sometimes they use it to mean the storage. And so it's accumulate and storage that hopefully I can get that into the vocabulary. Because the real metric is what happens in the atmosphere. If it changes the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, either up or down, that's what's important. And everything we focus on what's down here because we don't think of being up there. But the amount of carbon dioxide, not only focus on carbon dioxide, there are other greenhouse gases too, as you all know, in the atmosphere is what's determining the temperature and the temperature rise. And that is growing all the time. So we could be accumulating more of it out of the atmosphere than we are. In fact, what got me really confirming my suspicions, I worked on technology for 20 years. I was a 5-time IPCC author and coordinating lead author of the integrating chapter of the big renewable energy and climate change volume, and they're always big volumes. I'm sorry about that. And I began to think, you know, we're almost certainly going to be unable to build enough zero carbon renewable energy in time to really meet the goals of 1.5 or 2 degrees. And we've all known for a long time as scientists that remarkably less than half of what we put in every year appears as an increase in the atmosphere. And this was reinforced in the 6th assessment report that came out last year, the first volume of the 3 volumes that will be coming out. And in that, I'll paraphrase it, for the past 6 decades, the amount of carbon dioxide reaching the atmosphere is 56% less than we are putting in every year. Man, if we had technologies and could promise you technologies that would reduce by 56%, we'd be going for it. Instead, we're spending billions of dollars on technology for direct air capture and all kinds, and fusion power. Wonderful to do the research, but it's not going to be here by 2030, and it's not going to be here by 2050. But what is here and now is nature. Oceans, forests, land, wetlands, wastelands we call them, wetlands, grasslands, the peatlands, the frozen peatlands, all of those are removing that amount from the atmosphere every year and getting no credit for it. The policies run against doing anything about that. Virtually every policy we have. For example, in the European Union and the United Kingdom, and now in the United States with some of this recent legislation, the goal has become reaching 100% renewable energy. And none less than the Vice President of the European Commission was quoted in Glasgow when interviewed by a reporter, and this is a great job you do, is getting these people on record. So why is all this passion for burning wood in the EU? He said, well, we have to meet our goal of being 100% renewable energy by 2050. Without burning wood, we can't reach that goal. That is a legal requirement in the EU. It is in the UK. And we have made the similar kind of statements here in the recent legislation, the passage of the infrastructure bill. The goal is not to be renewable. The goal is to be zero carbon. And if you can get that message out, that would be a great addition. Just one other point to make. One of the articles that caught my attention in 2018 was by a group in Germany headed by a professor named Erb, E-R-B. Actually he's in Austria, in which they found that we could manage our forests and our grasslands so that they held twice as much carbon as they do today. The reason for that is we have managed them in a way that has reduced the amount of carbon in them by half. I'll stop there.
Great. We'll come back to some of that later. First, I want to turn to Ona now to talk about achieving consensus, given that we have policies that are weighted a certain way, and not necessarily valuing all of the services that land provides, but what are some of the strategies that you found for resolving disputes about what the highest and best use of land is, that have been the most effective, I guess, at bringing about a result that maybe everyone could agree is positive.
Thank you. Good morning. Oh, we're in person. I'm so used to the Zoom.
I know.
Right? Being able to mute all this stuff. Really nice to see you all. I'm Ferguson. I work at the Consensus Building Institute based here in Cambridge. And we do the people side of all of this. So we run committees, we run public meetings, we bring people together on natural resource and public policy topics. So obviously climate just threads its way through all of that. And to give you a little sense before I start kind of talking about solutions, that means, for example, I'm running a committee right now in Natick, Massachusetts, a stakeholder committee of 20 people who are trying to decide whether or not to remove a dam across the Charles River. And they're trying to come to a shared recommendation about this important decision with all the layers of information and risk and cost and important place-making things that we know for land matter. I wanted to say, my first job, when I started at CBI 20 years ago, I was teaching in this room. And so like place matters, right? I'm having this multi-layered experience being here with all of you. Another example, we run sea level rise task forces in some communities in partnership with the Lincoln Institute actually 7 or 8 years ago, where we were working with stakeholder groups trying to get them to start thinking about plans for the shoreline and what they would like to do. And it was a while ago, and the message even then, I think it was 2012, maybe 2013, the message even then from those groups was, we're like, okay, what sea level rise predictions do you want to use, right, as we map your shoreline? They're saying, we want to be conservative. And okay, so the planning team goes in the back and we're like, what do they mean they want to be conservative? It could go either way, right? It could mean two different things. They meant, we want the highest sea level predictions that we should be planning for. If we're planning for 50 years out, like tell us the bad news now so we can be smart. Like we're not children, like we want to know. And that really changed how I thought about working with the committees that I was working with and kind of what I expected from them. So the approach, piece that I think we have to offer in our work related to all of this is about the scale of the decisions that are made around land. So the climate situation is broad. We all know the time horizons are big. The information is high scale. But so many of the decisions on land use are made at even a neighborhood level, right? A building by building level, community level. And for those decisions to make sense, they have to involve the people there, right? You can't really do it top down. I have a colleague who talked about green infrastructure getting put in and how great it was. They had done all this great stuff. They went back 8 years later and nobody had been maintaining it because the community didn't really believe in it or understand it. They didn't invest in the cleanup. And he's like, it functioned the same way gray infrastructure would have functioned. We did all this work. We spent all this money to no effect. Like the solutions have to work for the community that you're in. And we're working right now with Lincoln and others on something called the Climigration Network, where we're trying to learn how to bring kind of practitioner expertise on sea level rise, flooding, climate risk, and local municipal leader expertise from frontline communities of neighborhoods where there is flooding, and bringing those two together to try to figure out how to empower them, how to look for solutions that are not top-down, not one-size-fits-all, like by talking to people, by supporting people in these communities. And then you hear, oh, you use tailings from lead mining in the foundations of the buildings. Oh, so when there's flooding here, what you're worried about isn't just water and mold. What you're worried about is like all the aerosolization, I don't know the right words, of all this toxic stuff in the foundations of your building. Like that's a whole different story, right? By listening to those people. You don't know it when you look at the maps. It's not going to tell you that. So it's hard and it's important and it's everywhere, right? All these different risks we're looking at.
Yeah. Just to follow up on that, you're talking about the importance of obviously people being invested in solutions and crafting solutions at this very local scale. How much generally holds true about people's major concerns about their communities, as a result of climate impacts? I mean, do they vary quite a bit, or are they generally pretty consistent? I'm just curious, as somebody who's worked with a lot of different, communities and groups on this smaller scale, kind of what have you found?
Say the question one more time. How much?
Sorry, basically, how consistent are people's main concerns about climate change's impact on their homes or neighborhoods? Or do they tend to vary depending on the community or where it is or who they are?
I would say the concerns about the kind of natural impacts are probably similar, right? You're worried about water or you're worried about heat if you know enough to worry about that. But there are a whole set of concerns that differ by community based on their experience working with those who have the power to do something about it. So we're working in New York City with something called the Forest for All NYC group, trying to build a coalition to support the urban forest. And we know that there are places where people don't want trees because they don't trust that if there are trees put in, they will be maintained, right? And so why do they want a tree that's going to fall over and cause them problems and get in their way if nobody's going to water it and care for it? And for those of us who live in places where the trees are generally maintained, this would not occur to us, right? It's more about the management side that's different, I think.
Right.
That's my take on it at the moment. It might change in a couple of years.
Yeah. Patrick, I had another question for you, which is, after you laid out these different types of conflicts, is there a particular tension or conflict that you see as maybe being the biggest barrier to climate action?
Yeah, I think there's two thoughts are kind of coming to mind, so I may answer it kind of in two different ways. The first, kind of only because what Ona was saying was making me think about solutions to all of these competing needs, and I think just because of the sheer scale of it, that conflict between agriculture and conservation is critical to meet any climate goals. It's not necessarily neither of those are barriers to climate action, but resolving those are inherently it's climate action. And I was thinking about kind of solutions to that, and looking at all these maps of all these different competing land uses and how they're changing. One far end of that could be, well, we just need to optimize land use globally. Where the best agricultural land we're going to devote towards agriculture, and the places, the peat lands that can sequester so much carbon, those are protected, and here's where people can this kind of very top-down level of rearranging land use to fit the best its best use, ignores all the things that you were just speaking to, and it's an easy line to draw when you're just looking at satellite imagery and spatial data, but then to get down on the ground, and especially when you're thinking about all of the livelihoods that depend on agriculture as a way of life, not just as the food that it provides, but I think a quarter of the world's population is employed in agriculture, and that number's far higher in low-income countries. And so it's not just solving the land use dilemma, but really the economic development and social development. So any kind of solution really needs to be have people front and center. If it's going to create any kind of world we want to live in that are just and equitable and inclusive. So that was just on my mind. I don't know how much of that was a response to your question, but in response to your question, I think, thinking particularly in the U.S., the conflict around siting renewables, I'm seeing as a big barrier to us taking, meeting our climate goals and taking action. We're going to have to find a way to, pretty rapidly deploy a lot of solar and wind and all that associated infrastructure, as I was mentioning, but without, compromising our prime farmland, our prime forest and natural lands. And we're already seeing these kinds of conflicts arising all across the country, from voters in Maine rejecting the transmission line that would have brought hydropower from Canada to Massachusetts, which was kind of a key piece of Massachusetts' climate goals, to conflicts you see around siting solar, whether it's conflicts with farmland or pristine tallgrass prairies. So there's got to be it's a new way to think about kind of the regulatory frameworks and governance structure and land policy that can permit this large-scale deployment of new infrastructure, but be mindful of all the other priorities that we have. So to me, it's a barrier that stands in the way. I'm less worried about kind of the regulatory side of things. I think we'll get to a point where we realize that kind of NEPA and all of those regulations are ineffective, and I think somehow I'm less worried about that, even though when it seems any kind of federal action is impossible. But I'm more concerned about siting renewables in places where it really doesn't make the most sense, where you're just compromising something else to meet that one goal, very much along the lines of what Bill was saying. And if you have just the market driving these decisions, it'll just go to whatever the market says is the highest value. But so there needs to be some policy interventions that steer decisions towards the right decision.
Right. Bill or Patrick, any ideas about what some of those policy interventions might be? What's coming to my mind is thinking, for instance, you might have one agency of the federal government trying to build, fast track like renewable energy transmission line, and then another one, handing out conservation easements, right, along that route. So, is there a way that processes could be reconciled or, unified, and priorities as well? But
Do you want to go first?
It's all yours.
All right. A little coordination would be a lot helpful. Let's put it that way. They're often working at cross purposes. As I mentioned with the bioenergy, it's more carbon intensive than coal, and you lose when you cut down the trees and burn them. You don't have the extra growth of those trees, which is not in their early years, but in their mid and later years. So you lose all that. Even if you get back to, you cut a 50-year-old bunch of trees and you protect it, the area, and you grow them back, and in 50 years you're back where you started. Of course, there was more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere during that time, and that made the planet warmer, and another glacier melted, there went sea level rise, some permafrost thawed, there went some methane. Those are not returned to where they were in 50 years, even if the carbon is. So we say carbon neutral is not necessarily climate neutral, and it's climate neutrality we're after. So here we're in a conflicting situation when we make mistaken ideas to make policies, and we still have an antiquated idea about conservation or preservation, being two slightly different ways of protecting land. Conservation is what Gifford Pinchot talked about and ended the absolute rampant destruction of forest. by saying we needed to manage them in a way that did the greatest good for the greatest number of people for the longest time. That's a very utilitarian reason for doing it. It's to serve our needs. And John Muir said, no, we should preserve it because that is an important value. And for many people, it's a religious value even, or if they're secular, it's equivalent to a religious value. If God put it there, who are we to take it away, kind of thing. And it's always been thought, well, isn't it nice those people want to protect those animals? Isn't it nice they want to protect that little patch of land over there? And it's been viewed as largely peripheral, frankly, to the real business of the world, which is business, and making the GDP grow. And in fact, what climate is teaching us is that no, the functioning of the planet depends on these natural processes. You may the late and lamented E.O. Wilson from Harvard made his famous dictum, nature needs half. You know, we're talking about 30 by 30, maybe 50 by 50, but that's not just area, that's functional ecosystems, and that's an important point. What we'll get if we aren't careful is 50% of the ocean where there are no fish. 50% of the land where there are no trees or no wetlands or no biodiversity, the wastelands, so to speak, or the mountaintops. That's what happened with the Wilderness Act in the United States. Wilderness on the rocks, I think the Sierra Club called it. And great to have it, beautiful mountaintops, lovely to have them protected, wild, but they're not doing a whole lot of ecological functionality for the planet. We mentioned the need for, so I think, you know, people talk about, well, there's climate change and existential crisis. I think it's beyond climate change. I think it's global change writ large that is the existential crisis. And as one of my colleagues said publicly one time, he said, you know, actually, I'm not so worried about us. The world will go on after we're gone. I'm worried about us. That what we're doing to the planet is endangering us. This notion about should we have multitasking on these lands? Well, that's the idea behind the multiple use sustained yield practices of the U.S. Forest Service, which have not worked out well, because you can't do everything on each acre of land. So it has to be thought of more broadly than that. And the other thing is that natural lands are already multitasking, right? The land is 31% of the removal of this carbon dioxide every year. 31% of that 56%. Oceans being the rest. And so that's one function, maintaining the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that will give us the Goldilocks climate that we've had. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. And so it's also doing the other thing. We talk about biodiversity being important. That's a nice thing. You know, I'm glad that you know, WWF is out there protecting tigers and so forth, and that makes me feel good. But I'm not sure I'd be happy having Bengal tigers in my backyard. I mean, I have bears in my backyard. I have wildcats, bobcats, and so on, but that's okay. I can live with those. But it's more fundamental than that. And at some point, I'd like to just read to you a statement from the latest IPCC report that came out February 28th. I don't know if should I do that now or later.
Maybe we should take some questions now,
Yeah,
and then we could end on.
If I could,
what
it's
I'm
very
sure is a
short.
cheery
It's very short. I will not read all 3,000 pages. I promise. Promise.
Any questions?